Fatima Badawi, again your moderator for today's discussions. So yesterday we gave you the broad picture about state and peace building, and today we're going to look a little bit more at more concrete examples, drawing on Rwanda's experiences, its innovative approaches both to peace building and socio-economic development. And then we also want to share experiences from other countries from the floor. So once we've discussed a little bit here on the panel, I'd very much welcome interventions from the floor. Our first speaker is, of course, the wonderful Foreign Minister here, Minister Louise Mushikiwabo. And just to very quickly tell you a little bit about the Foreign Minister, she's actually a linguist by training from the University of Delaware. She lived in the United States for 22 years and then returned to Rwanda in 2008 when she joined the cabinet, first as Minister of Information and then last year as Foreign Minister and Minister for Foreign Affairs and Cooperation. She's a highly acclaimed author and also contributes to radio and newspaper articles, and you co-authored, didn't you, Rwanda Means the Universe, so a measure of her dedication to her country. And also in 2004 the Minister received the Outstanding Humanitarian Award from the American University's School of International Studies, so one of the leading female persons not only here in Rwanda but also on the continent of Africa. And the Minister wishes to share some reflections with you on Rwanda's measures and the approaches that they've taken both to development and peace building. And Minister, I'm not going to let you start until these gentlemen coming in have taken their seats. So we'd appreciate that if we could begin our session. Thank you. Oh, yes, there we are. Is that, oh, yes, the Prime Minister. Sorry. Oh, right, and the Rwandan Speaker of the Senate. Good morning to you, sirs. All right, thank you very much. Foreign Minister, please, your comments.
Thank you, Zainab. Good morning, everybody. Your Excellency, Prime Minister Guillaume Soro, Your Excellency, Speaker of the Senate, dear colleagues, distinguished and honored guests of Rwanda at this conference, good morning. I want to begin this session this morning by telling you that I have so much to say that I have to limit myself. When we talk about the socio-economic transformation of this country, we actually need more than a day or two. So I have decided to just pick a few important examples of what Rwanda and Rwandans have done since the end of the genocide, which in my view has delivered the results that we see in this country today. I say this with the same caveat from the session yesterday that Rwanda has and still faces challenges, that what we as a nation have achieved is by no means a prescription for any other country, but perhaps just elements that could be used by other nations in their own struggle to build peaceful and prosperous nations. Let me take you back to where we were in the summer of 1994. I was discussing with the other panelists this morning and telling them how we Rwandans end up taking our road to recovery for granted. Things and life get back to normal, and we forget almost easily how complicated things were in this country right after the genocide. Let me first of all say that what has characterized Rwanda over the last 17 years is a national concerted effort to move away from what had caused us to be a divided nation, what had caused us so much grief as a nation, and it is a determination that accompanies us every day in everything we do. So in the summer of 1994, picture a country where 1 million plus people are dead, 3 million people have left the country in the surrounding countries. The very fabric of our society torn apart. What we believed in, what we grew up being taught about goodness and humanity. And we have words in our own language for that. Ubupfura, ubumuntu, important values that characterize us as human beings were no longer references after the genocide, because we had seen it all. We had seen women snatching babies from the back of other babies and killing them. We had seen teachers going after their students. We had seen doctors murdering their patients. So we had hit bottom. And we decided, and this is something that my president touched on also yesterday afternoon, that as a nation, to heal, we had to have a conversation with ourselves. Hence, the institution of a national dialogue. Let's talk it out, is what we decided. And so from 1994, those who were in positions of power and our citizens decided that it was very important that as a nation we talk to each other, starting with the most difficult issues we were facing at that time. How do we reconcile justice and reconciliation? Where is the boundary between remedy for crime and the necessity to move on as a nation? So that's where we were in 1994, and I'm not talking about the destruction of the country's infrastructure, the fact that genocide survivors were demanding justice when the nation wanted both to have justice but also to rebuild. It's been a collective national effort to move on. Now, the second element I wanted to bring in this morning, before I get to specifics on innovation, is what also has characterized our nation, besides the agreement to talk amongst ourselves, is the determination to openness. We had lived since the time of our independence in the early 60s in a country where there was no encouragement to open up even to our neighborhood. Very few Rwandans, all the way to the 80s, had set foot in Congo, in Burundi, or Uganda. We lived in a country that had a sort of paranoia of openness. So after what the country went through, we decided that we had to open up our minds, open up our borders, open up our education system, move away from the kind of political isolation that had been designed to keep a whole nation away from the eyes of the neighborhood and the world. So this openness, if I can give specific examples, went from, I was talking this morning about what an ordeal it was in this country to apply for a passport. A passport basically is a document that every national should have access to. Applying for a passport was quite a traumatic experience. We have now a country where we apply for any immigration document online, 17 years later. We have opened our borders by integrating in the East African community, by opening embassies in West Africa, a part of our continent that we had closed ourselves on. We have gone to Asia to look for both ways to move our citizens standards of living, but also to allow our citizens to have a perspective on the world and not remain behind. We have, I think most Rwandans in this room will agree with me, that one of the revolutions in this country today is our educational system. A system that was characterized for many years by discrimination. We had a quota system, we had regional considerations, we had ethnic considerations. Today we have an education system that is based on merit, that is open to everybody. And most of us that grew up and went to school in this country definitely see this as a major change in our society. The aspect of dialogue that I mentioned in a minute started right after the genocide in the late 90s, when Rwandans were looking for a way out of so many problems. And I want to point out the discussions that took place where what is today the President's Office, Urugwiro Village, where our leaders, plus academics, plus civil society, plus elder people, leaders of our communities, spent hours, spent nights discussing what should happen to this nation. What do we do about justice? And that's those Urugwiro discussions have produced, amongst other things, our very innovative Gacaca community justice, which is, I'll talk about it in a second, one of the mechanisms that have allowed this country to deal with the very difficult issue of justice. How does one give justice for genocide? We hadn't planned for it. We didn't have mechanisms in our society, in our legal and court systems. It was something new, and we had to find a way out. So these discussions that went on for days, over a number of years, have produced what is now in this country a step back into our tradition and our culture, where we went and pulled out some of the existing mechanisms that we have then modernized a bit, injected a bit of legal and financial modern notions, and made them work for our citizens. And we have also, as a nation, decided that we take everything to the grassroots. We take it to the districts, to the villages, to the communities, and this speaks to the issue that was discussed quite a bit yesterday in the leadership session on ownership. We had to own the good and the bad of this nation as a nation, not just as a leadership. Besides these discussions that involved all stakeholders in this nation, we went and looked for, in terms of poverty reduction and socioeconomic development, looked for some other mechanism that we had in our society. The solidarity schemes that existed in our communities that had been discontinued during the colonial time. And we came up with schemes that are very well known in our development world here in Rwanda today, such as Ubudehe. Ubudehe is community, solidarity, self-help, where citizens decide in their own community who's more deserving of help than others, help them find income-generating activity, and the community contributes. Then the government comes in and tops up the contribution and provides a means of living to the poorest in the communities. In the old days, Ubudehe was commonly practiced in different parts of the country without the intervention of the state or the financial innovation that we have today. And it has delivered some of the best mechanisms against poverty in this country. Let me talk about the community work known in this country as Umuganda, also as another example, which is every last Saturday of the month, all of us in this country get together either at a designated area with specific activities such as tree planting or cleaning or road construction, and we work together as a community with a dual purpose. One, to work together as a community, but also to interact socially. It helps us achieve a tangible economic result, but also allows us to interact socially. Most of the activities on Umuganda today are based on cleaning in the community, building, and supporting some of the activities that are initiated by our different districts. It could be water provision, it could be the construction of a health center, but most of it is usually activities that do not require complicated machinery. Now, all these innovations cannot be complete without me talking about bringing back the woman in this society to the role that was designated for her, also in our traditional society. And I want to give examples of where and why it's become easy for this country to advance so quickly with the participation of women. Our president usually responds to the question of how and why women have advanced in this country by saying that it's only smart politics, that you cannot ignore more than half of your constituency. But it's also true that in our society, for many, many years, what was the practice was for the woman to play an important role in the advancement of society. We have examples of young women who have replaced their fathers on the battlefield. We have women who have replaced their husbands as village chiefs in the old days. And one of my favorite is the Queen Mother. In our old society, during the times of the kingdom, where the Queen Mother was actually the top political advisor to the king. The king would not make any major decision for the country without consulting the Queen Mother. But I also want to say that what I think is different in this country, and I want to pay tribute to the people responsible for that this morning, is the attitude of Rwandan men, which is the attitude of Rwandan men has allowed this country and this nation to give the woman that which is her right. It has allowed men to make space for women in different positions. And I think I'm not mistaken if I say today that it's become part of our culture today to think of a woman when we plan for anything, both at the level of the government, but also in our communities and in our villages. So I'm not very fond of the word empowerment, because empowerment means that somebody gives you power. I think we have restored the power and the worthiness that the woman in this country had in our country and in our society from many years ago. So there is a lot to talk about in terms of women and the role they have played in the socio-economic reconstruction in the nation building that took place in this country. But if we could perhaps say that the woman, both at the level of decision-making and at the grassroots, has worked very hard. She has deserved the recognition that she has today. Women have contributed to the liberation of this country with their brain, with their weapons, with their time, with their, some have given their lives. Women bore the brunt of the violence that took place in this country. They lost their husbands, their children, their families, and they have gotten up and picked up the pieces and moved on. And that, I think, has given women in this country so much credibility and respect. And the contribution of women in this country to the reconstruction process cannot be overstated. Let me conclude. As I said, there is so much to talk about. Let me conclude on a very personal note to say that in the summer of 1994, right after the genocide, I was living in the United States at that time. I had lost family in the genocide in this country, and I vowed I would never set foot in Rwanda again. When I come back from travel abroad and come home today, there is nothing that feels as good as coming home. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed, Minister. As you said, there's so much you could say, and you've given us a great deal of food for thought. Just before we move to our next speaker, just very quickly wanted to ask you this, which is, you mentioned your educational system here in Rwanda and how you have to make sure that it's non-discriminatory and so on. But I just wonder if you could say a couple of sentences on the fact that you have to kind of build a culture of peace and do that through your education system. And this question of values is a very important one. Would you just touch on that perhaps, and how you do kind of, through your teaching programs, try to promote a sense of identity and a sense of peace amongst students?
Sure. Thank you. People who are more into education can contribute in a minute. But what I think has been different and has helped very much in this process of rebuilding our nation and our lives is the realization from the very young to the older members of our society that peace is priceless. We have had, in the times of incursions right after the genocide, mothers calling the police and the army on their own sons, young men, because they believed the kind of life they were engaging in was not the kind of life that was going to be sustainable. So the culture of peace is the foundation of everything we do. And there's been a lot invested in peace and stability, both in the formal educational system, but also in our discussions. I'll tell you something that struck me for a long time when I was looking at amendments to our Constitution a couple of years ago, that when our Constitution was drafted, we had the word peace and unity everywhere. So many articles of our Constitution brought the element of peace and unity. So before we even get to the educational system, the very fundamental law of this country says that Rwandans have decided that peace and unity has become the #1 factor. And basically, anyone who's not supportive of the importance and the fundamental value of peace and unity in this country is outside the framework that has been created for the new Rwanda. But we can get to specifics from those who are directly involved in education.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Bella Bird, sitting here to my left, you are British. You are a specialist in governance issues, originally an anthropologist by training. You've worked for 15 years with the Department for International Development in London, and 13 of those years were actually in the field, mostly in Uganda and Kenya. You are now country director for the World Bank of both Sudan and South Sudan. You've had a great deal of experience in this field, also working with the OECD's DAC Development Assistance Committee, looking at fragile states. Your experience now, your work in the Sudan, takes you in a somewhat slightly different direction from what we have in Rwanda, particularly in South Sudan, where perhaps the emphasis has been much more on breaking away, obviously, from the greater country. How far is there this culture of peace there, and how far do they need that in South Sudan? Because the emphasis has been very much on independence, rather than the kind of culture of peace, perhaps, that the Minister's been talking about.
Thank you very much, Zainab. Thank you also to the Minister. I think that was such a moving and passionate and informative presentation. I feel humbled to follow on from that, but I'll do my best. Your point on Sudan, Zainab, I think I would much prefer that our South Sudanese colleague respond to that rather than me from here, but I think clearly from my discussions with the authorities in South Sudan, peace building is really at the heart of their thinking. Peace and state building, moving from fragility to stability, and what are the key steps that they need to take. But I would ask for my South Sudan colleague to talk to the specifics. If I can, I'd quite like to just take us a little bit back to yesterday and then bring us back to today. I wanted to say a few words from the perspective of, primarily for the World Development Report on Conflict, Security and Development, which was published by the World Bank earlier this year, which many of you will be familiar with, and just give a few framing points around that, and then come back, I think, to connect it to the excellent presentation of the Minister. The World Development Report is this one on conflict, security and development was different in that it didn't just draw on research, it actually drew on a global conversation on conflict, security and development issues, which involved, I think, probably many of you in this room. It involved government, civil society, private sector, international policymakers. And really critically, it drew on the experience of 20 countries who are presently experiencing conflict or who indeed have escaped from it. And that include a range of countries from Singapore, Afghanistan, Ethiopia, Timor-Leste, Indonesia, and indeed Rwanda. And His Excellency Paul Kagame was in fact a member of the advisory committee on the World Development Report. Some of the, just as a sort of framing, a few framing points, some of the key conclusions that have come out of the WDR were around, firstly, that the conflicts are not one-off events, and that in the 21st century, the nature of conflict is recurrence of conflict. And there's an interesting fact which illustrates this, that in the past 10 years, 90% of the conflicts that have occurred in countries that had conflicts in the previous 30 years. So that's the vast majority of conflicts that are occurring in countries that have experienced conflict before. And the report talks a lot about the high cost of conflict. I think that's well known. I won't get into it there. But countries that have actually managed to break through this cycle of conflict and violence have shown to be able to make really rapid progress in achieving some of the Millennium Development Goals and the peace and stability that they're looking for. And Rwanda is one of the cases cited in the report alongside Ethiopia, Mozambique, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and others who can demonstrate what is required to break out of that cycle of conflict. The report looks importantly at what causes the cycles of conflict, and understanding that is important in terms of understanding how countries break through. And some of the key, it's complex. There's no clear definition of what causes conflict. We know that it's an interplay of political, security, and economic factors. But citizen perception surveys in a number of countries highlight three particularly key factors. One is unemployment, and that's not just the lack of income, that's lack of the sense of status and respect that comes with having a livelihood. Another is political exclusion and inequality, and there's a whole wealth of research which underlies the link between political exclusion, inequality and conflict, and that's seen, it's strongly associated with a high risk of civil war, and corruption, which fuels grievances and undermines institutions and social norms. And that's also, again, strongly associated with violence and conflict. But the absolutely fundamental conclusion of the report is that countries can even exist with unemployment, political exclusion, corruption, but remain stable. But the key determining factor is the strength of institutions that determines whether a country is stable or fragile. And these institutions, it takes us very much back into the discussion yesterday, these institutions can be both state and non-state, they can be national and local, and they're not organizations. It's important not to get confused between institutions and organizations. They can be almost everything on the list of points that the Minister made about the actions that had been taken in Rwanda. Institutions which actually build the state, and I'll come back to that in a moment. Just one more word on a couple of points on institutions. What you see in countries that are most vulnerable to violence and instability is, for example, peripheral regions which have very little presence of the state, where the absence of the state allows armed groups to dominate and control resources and people. Also, where state institutions are seen as partisan, and that's clearly very, very much relevant to the case of Rwanda, it's relevant to the case of Northern Ireland before the peace agreement, relevant to the situation of Nepal before their constitutional assembly elections. In those contexts where institutions are partisan, conflict and violence can flourish. And also states with high levels of corruption and human rights abuses in their institutions have a much higher risk of violence. So what's happening in countries that are breaking this cycle of violence? And I think, while the Rwanda case resonates so strongly with international experience on this, it is countries that have succeeded in building a number of key institutions which particularly achieve citizen security. They bring justice and they address grievances that people are feeling, and they provide jobs and employment. And another key conclusion of the WDR is that we should never think about importing institutional models from Western countries or even other countries, that the adaptation to context is absolutely key to the success. Again, this relates very strongly to the Rwanda case. They talk a lot about the best fit of institutions, and that's an important lesson for us in the international community of how we're listening and making sure that our own interventions are adapting to context. We know that building institutions takes time. There's a really frightening table in the WDR which shows that the countries who've made fastest progress in building institutions have taken sort of 20 to 25 years to get key institutions up and running. We know that progress can be made more quickly, as cases like Rwanda demonstrate. But investment of roughly 15 years is put forward in the report as being a reasonable time frame to think about. Building institutions which have the confidence of the people is critical. What you don't want are institutions which people don't believe in and don't actually build that state-citizen connection. That's another point that the report makes very clearly. So what are some of the practical steps that countries can look at taking, and we in the international system can look at supporting in countries making that transition out of conflict and fragility? I'll just highlight three things, and again I think link them back very much to the case of Rwanda. There's a really consistent message on the importance of sending signals which build confidence in the population as a country goes through transition, that things are changing for the better. And that could be, for example, the setting up of a national dialogue. It can be credible national and local appointments of leaders who have the respect and legitimacy, perceived legitimacy to lead. It can be action on transparency. It can be removal of discriminatory laws. It can be deploying security forces that are trusted into previously insecure areas. There's no one-size-fits-all. These signals of confidence building need to be determined locally and led by local leaders. But it's really important that international actors are attuned to that and supportive of them. The second issue that the report pulls together is the importance of developing national programs which build people's confidence and do transform the institutions and build the foundations for the institutions of the state and the society. And here again we connect very strongly with the Rwandan experience, where and the first area that the report highlights is bottom-up state building. So not looking at state building as a top-down set of national institutions, but how community-based programs that support state-society relations, particularly in insecure areas, how they can build the social cohesion and the national reconciliation. And where the innovation lies is programs which link violence prevention, justice, addressing grievances, service delivery, and employment. This is where the innovation is happening in countries emerging from difficult circumstances. And there are a number of examples around the National Solidarity Programme in Afghanistan, the examples we've heard about in Rwanda, community policing type initiatives linked to local courts, which are happening in a number of countries. This is where the innovation is occurring. The second area highlighted is back to basics job creation. Again, I think the Rwanda case, the self-help groups are a fantastic example of this, but there are other examples too on quite a big scale. For example, in India and Indonesia, programs which have operated on a very big scale, often in insecure areas, and serve to bring employment and jobs to people. Thirdly, the involvement of women in security, justice, and economic programs. Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Nepal, Rwanda too, also demonstrate how powerful these can be as a process of rebuilding the nation. And finally, focused anti-corruption initiatives that show that new initiatives in particular are well governed and also build social accountability and citizen ownership. And then finally, just one last innovation that is highlighted in the report, which is something that happens all the time in developed and middle-income countries, but rarely happens in fragile states, is citizen polling and feedback, and actually finding mechanisms through which citizens can communicate how their levels of confidence and trust and engagement in the rebuilding of a country. These are rarely invested in fragile states, and something that the report recommends that we should look at more. Thanks.
Thank you very much indeed, Bella. Bella, just really in a couple of sentences, thank you for your very interesting overview there. But when you're talking about countries, fragile states that have just emerged from conflict, where does general development policies, where do they begin and where do they end when it comes to conflict? What's the difference between just promoting development, which every country should do if it needs to obviously improve the well-being of its people, and what is the difference between general development and development when it comes to a country that's just emerged from a terrible conflict like Rwanda?
To answer your question, Zainab, I would refer you to the New Deal of the G7+, which I'm sure our Vice President from East Timor will be talking about. What the G7+ have said really strongly is that the Millennium Development Goals represent a development agenda, which is aspirational for fragile states. So we know that not a single low-income fragile state has achieved a single Millennium Development Goal. Why? Because we're rushing, all of us, straight to the MDGs, looking at growth, poverty reduction, social services, and we're forgetting about the peace building and state building that needs to happen in order to lay the foundations for development to occur. And in the New Deal from the G7+, and the international dialogue, there's 5 peace building and state building goals set out, and the way that the Vice President Jose Guterres' colleague Emilio Perez, who's the chair of the G7+, puts it, is that these are the preliminary things that countries need to focus on in order to make progress on regular development. This is about building the foundation of peace, stability, the foundations of the state, in order that and development will quickly follow if you focus on those peace-building and state-building goals.
Thank you very much indeed. And that brings us very neatly to our third speaker, Frederick Goloba, the fact that peace building is actually much more than just stopping conflict. Clearly, you are a professor of political development at Makerere University in Kampala, Uganda. You got your PhD from the London School of Economics, and you've been an academic all your life. You've got very extensive experience right across Africa, not only in East Africa, but also in South Africa and Sudan and Niger. And you're a regular contributor. You have your weekly column on the East African newspaper talking about public affairs in the Great Lakes region. And I wonder if you could give us some comments, really, following on from Bella Bird, about the fact that you need to have rural transformation and also to improve socio-economic factors. Health in particular is one of your specialist areas.
Yeah, thank you very much, Zaina. I've been doing research on and off in Rwanda for the last 10 years, but for this specific gathering, I'm going to talk about a very small aspect of the research that I have done here. But let me start by trying to put it into its context. One of the things that I have encountered with regard to Rwanda is the comment from the critics of post-genocide Rwanda that all the transformation happening in this country happens in Kigali, and that outside Kigali there is very little going on. Now, this provoked me into trying to find out exactly what goes on in rural Rwanda. And I went about it in this way. I requested that I be allowed to trail President Kagame as he went around visiting rural Rwanda. And I must thank Yolande Makolo for tolerating me. She ferried me around in her car for a fairly long period of time as I observed what was happening as President Kagame went around visiting rural Rwanda. During these visits, I was able to see evidence of really clear transformation, even in the farthest areas of Rwanda, which are very far from Kigali. These observations led to a decision on my part that some of the aspects of rural transformation actually needed to be investigated in depth. And the key question there was, how do the Rwandans make these things happen? I saw very extensive provision of clean water, very good-looking health units, and very many different things. And so at some point I joined a research program, the Africa Power and Politics program. It's based at the Overseas Development Institute, funded by the British Overseas Department for International Development. Now, the key focus of this research program has been trying to discover institutions that deliver for poor people. Our interest is really in looking at what happens in rural contexts and where things work, to try and explain what is it that makes things work in these contexts. Where things don't work, try to explain why they don't work. Now, we embarked on doing research in Rwanda, and our interest was mainly three things: maternal health, water, and sanitation. But today I'm going to talk about only two: reproductive health and water. Now, we started by doing preliminary fieldwork in one district, focusing on a single administrative area, the sector. And this was in Nyamagabe district, where we spent 2 months looking at how a single health unit functioned. This did then inform our decision to do a further 10 months in 2 districts, Nyamagabe and Musanze. And here we selected 2 sectors in each of these districts. And we selected some of the most remote areas to try and see whether actually the reach of the Rwandan state does not extend to the most remote areas of the country. And in selecting these field sites, I worked closely with the former Minister of Local Government, Protais Musoni, who helped me identify areas which he thought actually merited very deep study to try and understand the processes of transformation. I had a research team with me consisting of 4 people, 3 Rwandans and a young British woman, and we sent them out to go and live in these districts for 10 months, continuously. And during this period, they were observing what was going on and also interviewing people. Now, in connection with maternal health, our interest was in tracing what happens. When a woman falls pregnant, what is her first point of contact with the formal healthcare system? And what happens from that point until the child is delivered? What sorts of interactions does she have with the formal healthcare system? We were able to observe all that. In terms of water delivery, we wanted to know, how do people access clean water? What kinds of different sources of clean water exist in rural Rwanda, and how are these organized, and how are they delivered? Now, we discovered that there were three, of all the innovations that people talk about and that the Minister of Foreign Affairs told us about in her presentation, three seem to be really key in these processes. The Imihigo, the performance contracts, the Muganda community work, and then the Michel de Sante, the community health care, the community health insurance. Now, I'm going to move on very quickly to just give a broad overview of what we thought were the outcomes of all these processes. Now, looking at maternal health, Rwanda has registered really dramatic change in terms of the drastic fall in maternal and infant mortality. And the figures are actually quite breathtaking if you compare Rwandan figures to the figures that we have seen in the 5 other countries where the Africa Power and Politics Program is doing research. We have also seen a dramatic rise in the number of pregnant women who give birth under the care of trained professionals. Now, in other countries, a very significant number of pregnant women actually give birth within the confines of their villages under the care of traditional birth attendants. Now, Rwanda seems to have reversed this story. Now, an increasingly large number of women deliver under the care of trained professionals. We have seen a rapid rise in the embracing of family planning to the extent that I'm not aware of any other country where actually rural men have embraced vasectomies. In Rwanda, more and more men are actually opting to go for vasectomies in order to reduce the number of children they have. And this is very much connected to the community health insurance. Because when we were interviewing the women who are opting to have fewer children and the men who are opting for vasectomy, one of the explanations they were giving us was that the smaller your family is, the less you bear in terms of costs of insurance and costs of looking at your family. Now, when we look at water, there has been a rapid increase in access to clean water. There are several sources of clean water in these 2 districts where we were working. There is piped water, and it's really quite surprising that you go to the very, very remote areas of Rwanda and you find piped water being installed there. Now, people can opt to have piped water, to draw their water from the network of piped water that is being rolled out, or they can opt for protected traditional sources. So it seemed to us as if, at least in these 2 locations, people were spoiled for choice. The idea that rural people do not have access to clean water in this country, for us, it just seemed to be an idea of the past. Now, as an aside to what we were observing in rural Rwanda, we also looked at the outcomes of another innovation, which is land consolidation, which involves synchronized planting and harvesting. And we could see the extent to which this particular innovation has increased food production in rural Rwanda. Now, if you ask me how all these things link to peace building, I would have a very simple answer. My answer would be that people who are healthy, well-fed, and happy with their circumstances are also people who have a stake in the preservation of peace and stability. And I will end my presentation there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. And just a brief comment on what you just said, how it's important to have proper development. It seems that a key message from what you're saying is when you come to ensure that people do enjoy a peace dividend, it's very important to have all government departments working together. If you wish to improve people's health, it's not just the Ministry of Health that's involved, it's also the Minister for Transport and Infrastructure, the Minister for Education, Finance, everybody pulling together. Would you say that you do need that kind of joined up thinking? I know it sounds like stating the obvious, but actually there's no point improving somebody's health and then sticking them back in inadequate shelter. where they have no clean water and so on, because they're going to go back and present themselves to hospital again.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that one thing that I could say about the Rwanda government, or at least as far as I know it, is I think that one can describe the Rwandan government as a joined-up government. Because at least in one of the areas where we did our field work in Kaduha is very, very far from Kigali. And the roads to Kaduha, at least at the time we started doing field work, were so bad that from a distance of 32 kilometers took us 2 hours to cover. But before we left that area, the roads were completely renovated, and the time we spent using that road reduced drastically to 45 minutes. And we saw that as a result of this improvement, people could much more easily get their produce to markets. We could see the work of the Agriculture Ministry in terms of land consolidation and encouraging people to produce food, and so on and so forth. So I wouldn't be exaggerating if I said the Rwanda government is a joined-up government.
So that's a very key message in terms of learning from the Rwandan experience. I'd like to go to the floor. We have the Côte d'Ivoire Minister for excuse me, women, gender, family, children, Raymond Goudou. Can I see you? It'd be interesting if you could, yes, thank you, Minister, share your experiences briefly from Ivory Coast, because the Foreign Minister talked about gender empowerment is a vital factor in all this.
Je vous remercie beaucoup. Mesdames et messieurs, je voudrais déjà m'excuser pour la voix de crapaud que je vous présente ce matin. Je ne suis pas très en forme. Alors, concernant justement le thème qui nous amène ici ce matin, je pense qu'il est important que nous puissions ensemble partager ensemble les quelques activités que nous avons menées en cette période post-crise qu'a connue la Côte d'Ivoire juste après des élections, comme l'a précisé le Premier ministre hier, refusées par l'ancien président Laurent Gbagbo. Notre premier président, le président Félix Houphouët-Boigny, disait que la paix n'était pas un vain mot, mais que c'était un comportement. Effectivement, pour que nous puissions arriver à une réconciliation vraie, mais pas une réconciliation de fait, il faut évidemment que nous passions par la vérité. Il faut également que nous passions par le changement de comportement que les Ivoiriens se sont appropriés pendant plus d'une dizaine d'années. Par rapport à cela, en ce qui concerne mon département, le ministère de la Famille, de la Femme et de l'Enfant, nous avons pensé qu'après cette crise, et avec l'engagement des femmes pendant toute cette période de crise, je pense que tout le monde ici a dû voir sur Internet que l'ex-président, lors d'une manifestation des femmes, parce qu'elles cherchaient justement à manifester pour la démocratie et le résultat des urnes, l'ex-président a envoyé des chars et sans tenir compte qu'ils avaient devant eux des femmes, ils ont envoyé des obus pendant la manifestation des femmes aux mains nues, et des femmes ont été abattues, tuées, dépecées, et c'était horrible. Alors, par rapport à ça, nous avons donc au niveau de notre département, nous sommes dit que puisque le gouvernement a décidé, comme vous d'ailleurs et comme d'autres pays qui ont connu les périodes de crise profonde, d'aller à la réconciliation par le dialogue et par la restauration morale, psychologique. Dans mon département, par rapport aux violences basées sur le genre, nous avons tenté une expérience. Au sein même de mon ministère, nous avons pensé qu'il était bien de mettre un projet pilote, mais vraiment quelque chose de simple, mais donner l'occasion aux victimes, les femmes, les enfants et même des hommes, d'avoir la possibilité de pouvoir s'exprimer, de se vider, parce que nous pensions qu'il n'est pas possible d'arriver à une vraie réconciliation si on n'accepte pas de parler, de dire ce qu'on a ressenti pour pouvoir aller à une vraie réconciliation. Alors, donc, pendant les années 2000-2007, nous n'avions pas réellement de données exactes en ce qui concerne les violences basées sur le genre. Mais par contre, à partir de 2007, il y a quelques données. Je vais vous donner, rien que pour vous édifier, juste quelques données. Alors, des données sanitaires, en ce qui concerne les viols, nous avons 856 cas, dont plus de 53% en zone centre-nord-ouest affectée par le conflit. Nous avons une région qu'on appelle Daloa, qui est dans le centre-ouest, et Yamoussoukro, que tout le monde connaît, qui est une zone de transit d'accueil pendant les crises. Nous avons eu 140 plaintes de commissariat dans les commissariats, dont 10% de violences sexuelles et 39% relevées dans cette région qu'on appelle Daloa, qui est une région du centre-ouest. Au sein de mon ministère, nous avons une cellule, appelée cellule de lutte contre les violences basées sur le genre. Et au cours de cette petite expérience, nous avons noté 72 cas de viol sur 9934 cas de violence de tout genre. Ces violences peuvent être des violences de ménage, ça peut être également des violences où les hommes battent leurs femmes, enfin bref, plusieurs types de violences. Notre expérience à nous, voilà les chiffres que nous avons relevés. Alors, sur 977 cas de violences basées sur le genre, les Nations Unies organisées en clusters et surtout basées dans l'ouest de la Côte d'Ivoire nous ont donné des chiffres assez édifiants. Donc sur 977 cas de viol, nous avons nous avons 496 cas de viol de janvier 2011 à juillet 2011. Donc cela est extrêmement récent. Alors, je vais juste, excusez-moi, je vais peut-être prendre un peu de temps, mais je voulais vous dire que l'expérience que nous avons menée est extrêmement importante parce que nous avons pensé que c'était ce cas pilote pouvait permettre à la Côte d'Ivoire de voir qu'effectivement, le fait de mettre l'accent sur les victimes féminines permettait de voir qu'en Côte d'Ivoire, qui a 51% de femmes, que les femmes étaient extrêmement impliquées dans ces cas-là et qu'il fallait tenir compte d'elles. Juste un petit mot pour vous dire simplement que nous avons donc, par rapport à cela, mandaté, lors d'une visite dans l'ouest de la Côte d'Ivoire, toutes les femmes de Côte d'Ivoire à s'approprier la réconciliation, la réhabilitation et la restauration morale pour une réconciliation vraie. Voilà un peu vite dit les éléments d'expérience que nous avons menés depuis que nous sommes là, c'est-à-dire depuis le 1er juin, depuis l'installation du président Alassane Ouattara. Je vous remercie.
Merci. Thank you very much indeed for giving us your perspective on this very important topic of gender-based violence. And very briefly, Foreign Minister, if you just want to pick up on that, but apart from gender-based violence, one of the key things you've done in gender empowerment here in Rwanda that's crucial is the right to inheritance, which we see sadly right across the continent of Africa, that women, particularly women farmers, their husbands die and they find themselves totally disinherited and actually just relying on the goodwill of their children in order for them to survive, which is really an awful scandal. And I just wondered if you could very briefly comment on that.
Thank you, Zainab. I want to point to that specific right to inheritance as a result, and I think I have to tell my sister from Côte d'Ivoire that once you get women involved in appropriating and owning the process of reconciling and stabilizing the country, there are a number of things that happen very quickly, including some of the legal rights that then allow women to build even further in terms of their own lifestyle and importance in society. The right to inheritance in this country is a result of serious lobbying by women's groups, especially women in civil society, right after the genocide, where we found, I think because of the situation, and again, Rwanda is a product of its experience, when women found themselves in situations where husbands and family members had died, and society and definitely our legal system not ready for that kind of situation. Women got together, got legal support, and decided to lobby very heavily our parliament to allow women to inherit. And I think also to credit the women the Association of Women Parliamentarians, who have also specifically lobbied within the parliament, of which they are members, to reach some of these important legal milestones.
It helps, isn't it, that you've got something like 45% of Parliament is made up of women, is that right?
56.
56, yes. Even better. That's I think that's a world record, isn't it? More women in Parliament than anywhere else. Now, please, from here on, I cannot accept any more prepared speeches because we started late and we've got 2 more sessions. So no more prepared speeches, please. I have to keep your interventions to really just very brief ones. I'd like to call on the Minister of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation and Communities of Guinea-Bissau, the Honourable Mamadou Salou Diallo Piresh. Yes? Here or not? Yes? If you wish to make a comment, remember we're looking at lessons learned from Rwanda from your perspective. If you could just give us a couple of brief comments, please, Minister, if you would like to. If you don't, it's not compulsory. Yes?
Ouais.
Briefly.
Merci, mais je m'excuse parce que, comme vous le savez, la Guinée-Bissau a la langue portugaise comme langue officielle. Mais comme il n'y a pas d'interprétation de la langue portugaise, nous allons parler en français, mais c'est une langue que nous ne maîtrisons pas. Ok, je crois que il y a beaucoup d'enseignements que nous avons reconnus dans l'expérience de la Rwanda dans ce qui concerne surtout le renforcement des institutions d'État. Nous croyons que le renforcement des institutions, c'est très important parce que chez nous, les institutions d'État restent plus fragiles après les conflits. Mais l'autre leçon que nous pouvons retirer dans l'expérience rwandaise, c'est l'implication des femmes dans le processus de réconciliation nationale et même au niveau du développement économique du pays. Parce que chez nous, aujourd'hui, les femmes jouent un rôle important, très important, dans le domaine du développement économique. Parce que quand les hommes n'ont pas d'emploi, ce sont les activités des femmes au niveau commercial surtout qui permet de soutenir les familles, la famille. Comme ça, c'est une leçon que nous pouvons retirer dans l'expérience de la Rwanda au niveau de l'implication des femmes dans le processus de la réconciliation et aussi dans le processus de développement économique du pays.
Thank you. And just one question. Do they have the right to inheritance in Central Africa, in Guinea-Bissau? Do women have the right to inheritance as they do in Rwanda when it comes to farms, agricultural land?
Oui. Ils ont le droit de l'héritage, mais il y a un problème dans le domaine de la législation parce que nous continuons à appliquer une législation qui vient de l'époque coloniale. Dans ce cas, la femme est mise dans la 4e position au niveau des héritiers. Comme ça, le ministère de la Justice de la Guinée-Bissau va proposer un amendement à la loi pour mettre la femme et les fils en premier lieu.
Let's hope they make that change very soon. Thank you very much indeed. I believe we also have the Minister of Cooperation of Central African Republic. Are you here? Yeah? Yes? If you would just very briefly, really no more than a minute or two, on shared experiences in this area. Thank you. If you press the button for the microphone.
Ouais, je voudrais d'abord saluer l'initiative de cette rencontre qui nous permet aujourd'hui de nous retrouver ici, à Kigali, pour tirer les leçons de ce qui a été fait dans ce pays après tout ce qu'il a connu. Et je voudrais dire que les situations de conflit ne sont pas à souhaiter. En ce qui concerne la République centrafricaine, j'aimerais beaucoup plus parler des violences basées sur le genre. Vous savez que lorsqu'il y a des cas de viol, les viols d'une manière générale, comme on le sait, constituent une arme de guerre. Et en ce qui concerne la République centrafricaine, les violences basées sur le genre ont été très mal perçues, vécues dans le pays, de sorte que les stigmates sont encore là. Il est très difficile de s'en séparer et tout un travail de prise en charge psychologique des victimes a été engagé, de sorte que progressivement, à travers les actions qui sont entreprises, ces femmes recouvrent leur place au sein de la société. J'aimerais quand même insister sur le fait que ces femmes victimes de viols surtout sont rejetées dans la société. C'est comme si ces femmes avaient souhaité être violées. Et c'est ça le drame. Donc il y a tout un travail qui est fait autour de ça, puisque le temps imparti ne permet pas de parler des autres aspects. Je mets l'accent beaucoup plus sur les viols que ces femmes ont subis. Pour dire que, pour revenir un peu sur ce que Madame la ministre des Affaires étrangères du Rwanda a dit, les femmes constituent le socle de nos sociétés africaines. Les femmes ont toujours été au centre des préoccupations dans nos sociétés. Et j'ai entendu ici tout à l'heure dire que les reines-mères étaient très importantes dans nos sociétés parce que lorsqu'un chef ou un roi avait une décision d'envergure à prendre, il fallait qu'il s'en réfère à sa femme. Donc le fait que l'image des femmes, au moment où la colonisation s'est implantée dans nos pays, que cette image des femmes se soit détériorée pour qu'ensuite ces femmes soient considérées comme des objets juste à subir des actes ignobles de violence, de viol, ont été vraiment, c'était des plaies qu'il nous faut aujourd'hui chercher à enrayer systématiquement dans nos sociétés pour permettre aux femmes africaines de jouir de toute la place qui leur revient de droit pour qu'elles puissent assumer l'éducation de leurs enfants. Donc j'insiste sur ce que nous devons faire pour mettre un terme définitif aux violences basées sur le genre. Je vous remercie.
Thank you very much indeed. So, thank you very much for that intervention in the Central African Republic. Clearly, as you were saying, Minister, it's not just gender promotion, but gender empowerment that is absolutely vital. A brief comment now from the Deputy Prime Minister of Timor-Leste. I will come back to you again later on when we come to a different session. But just very quickly, one of the key things that the Foreign Minister also talked about was this need for a national dialogue and reconciliation after you've been through a terrible conflict such as in East Timor. And can you just very briefly tell us a little bit about the national dialogue you've had? I know from my own interaction with your Prime Minister, as he was then a few years ago, José Ramos Horta, the Nobel Peace Laureate, that he talked to me very much about the need to balance the needs of justice, but also peace and reconciliation. Sometimes he said that actually you have to forego the pursuit of justice in order to promote reconciliation and peace. And I wondered if you could comment on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Zaina. And it's a great honor for me to be here, and I thank the Rwandan government for giving us this opportunity to share our ideas and experience also. First, the Rwandans have to be congratulated for what you have achieved. I believe that after so many people that died in a horrible way in this country, the survivors have had the courage and the humanity to find new ways to reaffirm the values that are common to all of us, wherever we live, you as human beings. That is respect for human lives. And the fact that today you have peace and stability is also, I believe, that has in Timor, is because the leadership of today knows how to past is a reference, but we have to look into the future. That's what we did, and that was the way how we do also in East Timor, a country where during the resistance we have lost almost 1/3 of our population. In 1 million, less than 1 million, we have lost around 200,000 people during 24 years of war. So the question of reconciliation for us is fundamental. Many people have suffered, direct suffering, families. But one of the ideas that we have also is that as a nation we have achieved justice. That is to have an independent country, a free and a democratic country. So that is very important also for us. And another notion is that whatever we did in the past as freedom fighters, we did it because we wanted to. And so the sacrifice that we have endured also is because we as human beings also, we wanted to stand up for freedom and democracy. One of the great experience that I have to acknowledge that is very important is the national dialogue that Rwandans have been doing. This is really important because we have created a system, a democracy, parliamentarian, where we have a debate every year on the budget. It's a very transparent and live to the entire population. But I feel that after knowing about the Rwandan experience, I believe that it's something that we can do in Timor-Leste, that is organize yearly meetings in which leadership can answer to the question from all the entire population, whoever wants to participate. So this kind of inclusiveness is great, and it comes to my mind also something that is political parties, they are not the only means for the people's participation. NGOs is important, and so this kind of broad participation of people is very, very important.
You know, we know from Rwanda that, is it right that something like 124,000 people were at one time detained, waiting for some kind of trial, whether it was through the Gacaca or any other way? I mean, just very briefly, where are you at on that? How many people were actually tried and how many were actually locked up as a result of being found guilty of that 124,000?
Zainab, if you allow, I see my colleague, Minister of Justice, sitting, trying to hide back there. He has the numbers, but I know the number was much higher than 124,000. So if you can comment very quickly.
Just very quickly on that, because it may be, we heard the numbers there from Timor-Leste. So through the traditional courts and so on, how quickly did you manage to...
Thank you, Minister Ruiz. Thank you, Zaina. I think around 1994, after the massive arrests, we had it close to 200,000. Then there was a political action that was initiated, I think around 96, that took care of the very old, the sick, the children, and there was a quasi-political, quasi-legal action to liberate those that were very sick or very old or that were very young at the time and were sent to rehabilitation center. That process reduced the numbers from close to 200,000 to about 150. Other subsequent interventions brought the number down, even before the actual trials, to close to 120,000. So those are the figures that were locked up in prison. Today we are talking about a total prison holdup of about 58,000 in total. So down from 200,094 to 58. Of the 58,000, about 38,000 are on genocide account. But the courts that we talked about, the Gacaca courts, have tried close to 1.2 million cases, and most of those have not been sent to prison, but have been reintegrated into the communities on the basis of the political choice of preferring the TISH, the community programs or community work, and also those that pled guilty, had enough remorse, their sentences were reduced such that they have finished their term of imprisonment. So most of those have therefore been reintegrated back into their communities, and the process is ongoing. And as a result, just in conclusion, we have closed now 3 prisons in the country. We closed the Nyagatare prison in the east and turned it into a child rehabilitation center. We closed Nyanza prison in the south, and we closed Josovo prison in the west because of the diminishing numbers. We have also built a modern prison in Mpanga in the south. We've built a modern prison in Rubavu in the north, and one in Musanze. So the process is ongoing to make fewer prisons and fewer prisoners.
I think that's a very important lesson. Yeah, just before you go, Minister, on this, very briefly, where do you stand on, I mean, yesterday I think it was President Kagame who talked about obviously national ownership and so on, and also national ownership of this pursuit of justice, but also balancing it with reconciliation, as you've just told us now, those who've shown remorse and so on are reintegrated into the community or they serve community sentences. Where does Rwanda stand in terms of international justice? Because we've seen obviously some of the more outstanding cases being dealt with at the UN tribunal in Arusha and so on, and where people now in North Africa are saying, we've gone through terrible conflicts, we want to know, we want to have ownership of our own justice system to seek those. What would Rwanda say in this live debate at the moment? International or national?
Thank you very much. I think the President said it well. We have survived as a nation because we have tried to own our initiatives at all costs. When, for example, the idea of Gacaca was introduced, there was massive resistance. They called kangaroo courts. They called all sorts of derogatory titles because it did not fit into the normal definition of justice within the concept of the Western definition of justice. So we stood our ground and were able to move the process forward. And as a result, we've been able to try, as I said, about 1.2 million people. We have reintegrated them into the community. They are living side by side with their former tormentors. There are no revenge killings, so we think it is a success. But somebody will still come up and say, oh, this is flawed justice. Yes, that's according to their judgment, not according to our judgment as a country.
Thank you.
And so I think we steer the course. And then you talk about international justice. I think we have a moment to laugh and a moment to cry every now and again when it comes to our attitude towards international justice. On one hand, it is so blind to what's going on. People are so trapped in their own understanding of justice that they fail to see what's going on here. So many times they make very wrong assessment of what's going on here. But recently we have had some reason to be happy. I think a number of courts in Europe, I'll talk of Norway, I'll talk of Sweden principally, I'll talk of the decisions in the Netherlands, I'll talk of the decisions across Europe, but also particularly talk about the recent decision of the European Court of Human Rights that decisively said the conditions in Rwanda here, the justice system had become of age. And if we can stop there and ask other people to confirm that, we shall be happy.
Thank you very much indeed for that. And now, thank you. Just a minute intervention, please. Again, learning from the experience of Rwanda, from the Rwandan Unity and Reconciliation Commission, Dr. Jean-Baptiste Habyarimana, a brief comment from you in something that's not been said, please. Don't repeat what's already been said, to your fellow delegates here. What would you want to share from the Rwandan experience?
Well, thank you, Zena. I'm not Habyarimana, I'm Bishop John. I'm the president of the commission. I think Rwanda still stands to own a unique situation from the crash of the caused by the genocide. And actually, long before the genocide, that built up to the genocide, Rwanda therefore had to work very hard to rediscover, to work hard to see who are we in the circumstances and what do we need to do to be a nation again and a people again, and also to be able to reclaim our dignity as a people from the crash, and also be able to take responsibility to design our destiny. It's an imperative calling and a commitment that the people of Rwanda had to be united, to be reconciled, painfully as it is and stands. But in order to do that, we had to search into our history and see the made-up of the destruction from a people who speak one language, have one culture, belong to one country, who got united naturally into the making and eventually ended up with destruction. So that became the source of the revival of the unity and reconciliation of Rwanda. And all efforts invested into it has resulted into the result. The unity and reconciliation is not just a luxury. It's a source of energy, it's a source of power to develop and to sustain the development that is taking place. And you mentioned the values. The Unity and Reconciliation Commission, which is constitutional by the people of Rwanda, has not only restored our values through education. We have the training of the population to revive our traditional values, and not only values, but engage the values for the development and the dignity of the people. And that is actually resourced by the development and efforts to sustain ourselves.
Okay, thank you. Jean-Baptiste Habyarimana, I think you are here, but perhaps you don't wish to comment. Can I just very briefly now, 30 seconds, each person, anybody want to contribute from the floor? Again, sharing Rwandan experience. Yes, introduce yourself, please. And really, really short. I'm just going to have to, if I had a button here to press your microphone on and off, I would. But go on.
Thank you.
If you introduce yourself.
I'm Dr. Matthias, State Minister for Primary and Secondary Education. there was a question on how the education system in Rwanda is, let's say, focusing on values and how we build our state. First of all, we have to recognize that ignorance is a source of divisionism. And an author said, tell me what you teach to your children, and I will tell you who you are. So our country, Rwanda, is focusing on a number of policies, programs, and curricula, let's say, targeting knowledge per se, but with our net enrollment of 96%, and for the net enrollment in our schools, we have to think what we have to do to build our state. We have to target, we have to focus on our peace building and our stability of the nation. So a number of programs, let's say, focusing on patriotism, civic education, leadership development schools, what we call in our traditional language, itorero. We look at this element to inculcate positive values to our nation, to our children. We can't say that you build your state. You are looking at its stability. You are focusing on peace building without job creation. Saying that job creation is the key. It means that we have to look at skills development. We have to look at entrepreneurship in our schools. So this government is looking at this, and we are focusing on these key components.
Thank you.
It has been decided, and it is the motto of this country. Our president is committed. We have a strong leadership, and we have to look at
Thank
this.
you.
Thank you.
Deputy Minister, that's a very, very vital contribution. Thank you. Leading on from my discussion on values. Good citizenship, very important to promote in the classroom. Yes, a lady here briefly, and then another hand there if you introduce yourself very briefly.
Thank you to the panelists and to this gathering. I'm the Minister of Health, Dr. Binagwaho, and I want to complete you, sir, because there's something you cannot see when you go only in a few sectors. We manage, the basis of all our actions are equity. That means what you see in that sector, we need to recover, to see it in all the sector, because this country was divided not only based on ethnicity, but also on region. North, South, etc. So that means we have got the DHS study, Demographic and Health Survey, and what has pleased us as government is that the difference of access to care and delivery that you talk about between rural and urban became so little, and that is the measurement of our success. And when you say that women are as the deaths of women have drastically diminished, we came from 8 women that were dying a day to less than 1. And in my report, I have every day the name of the woman who died, if one died, the place she lived, and why. And we go there and ask why. What could be done to avoid that? We have 35% of all our pregnant women who have 4 antenatal clinics now, and 70% of them deliver in a health facility. 90% attend antenatal clinics, but 35% for antenatal clinic. So this is something that is very important when you build peace and security, to build it on equity, on geographic equity, gender equity, age equity. Don't forget the children, they never talk. So this is something that have to be a pillar of any action.
And Minister, when Professor Frederick Goloba talked about the joined-up thinking in government, as Health Minister, just a brief comment on that, because we talked about the social determinants of health and the need for everybody working together. Do you get the cooperation you want from your fellow cabinet members?
Absolutely. This government, I don't work as a Minister of Health, you know. All my success belongs to Minister of Local Government, to all my colleagues, to the parliamentarian, because they go and spread the word and help our program. My role is just to think about what can be improved and put in the discussion all the people that can help me. So we work as cluster. This government works in 3 clusters. We have the governance cluster, the economic cluster, and the social cluster. And in the social cluster, I co-chair with my colleague from education. We have Minister of Youth, Minister of Gender, Minister in charge of employment, Minister in charge of gender. And together, when we have a problem, we meet together and we discuss. But more than that, we have the permanent secretary that meeting on regular basis. We have the technician in the health sector and all our sectors that meet. We meet around youth employment. It is my business. You know, I'm sharing the committee that do the work for my colleague. But my colleague meet on my problem on malnutrition, my problem on family planning. And that's how we came from 3 in 2000 family planning uptake to more than 45. Mm-hmm. We cannot do that alone. We have a government that has to work as one under the leadership of the man on my left, who is the Prime Minister. We report to him on success. And if education has a problem, I'm chairing that committee, I am answerable to that.
Thank you. That's very important. And I think we had that overview yesterday about the avoidance of every department working in their own silos, and your figures speak for themselves. Yes, is that Moses from South Sudan? Yes, some comments from you. Briefly, Moses.
Very brief. I just want to share the issue of peace and unity. It's an example in South Sudan that before this comprehensive peace agreement signed in 2005, there was a division in the movement in 91. That was a very serious division, and it cost a lot of lives. But in 91 there was a division that caused a lot of life. But the peace agreement could not be, the comprehensive peace agreement could not be possible without coming back as one South Sudan to fight for the liberation of South Sudan. So that was achieved in 2005, and we couldn't continue with the agreement. It was not enough because there were a lot of armed groups which were fighting the SPLA. We were recruits from Khartoum. What we did, what the government did, and the leadership of His Excellency the President made a point that all those armed groups have to be brought under one banner. So we managed to get all the armed groups into the SPLA, and then when we were also working when the referendum came, it didn't come as a lot of work had also to be done. That the political parties said and agreed that we are going for the referendum as united people, and that's why we managed to get 98.883%, which is very high. The other thing is that the reason why we are participating in the international dialogue as South Sudanese, simply because we know that we have to learn from others, and we will continue to learn from others. Like when we come to Rwanda, like this one, it is the reason for us to come and learn from Rwanda how they have been going on with their unity and peace. In terms of women involvement, we in the constitution, in the interim constitution of the peace agreement, we have 25% of women involvement in the political arena in the whole country. That is because simply why it is 25%, somebody will say that is a very low figure. But mind you, South Sudan, the literacy rate in South Sudan is very low, the lowest in the world. In fact, it is 27. 27% of people, South Sudanese, are literate, those who can read and write. So those are some of the things I wanted to
Thank you.
inform the
Thank you,
the
Moses.
gathering.
And I think my point originally to Bella Bird about South Sudan was about the fact that once you gained your independence, one could think that perhaps you no longer feel that there's a need to promote a culture of peace and unity amongst yourselves in South Sudan. And that was the point I was making there, that everybody wishes to encourage that culture of peace and unity within the south of Sudan itself. But thank you very much indeed for your comments. We're going to break for coffee just very, very briefly. Bella Bird, your concluding remarks just for a minute, incorporating some of the points that we've heard from the floor, and then the same to you as well, Professor Frederick Goloba.
Thank you, Zainab. Just 3 quick points. That was a fantastically rich discussion, and I've been privileged to be part of it. I just wanted to pick up on 3 things. Firstly, on the point about raised by the Vice President of Timor-Leste about people's participation, and that political parties is only one mechanism. And I think that's something that comes through again and again in the work in the experience of fragile and conflict-affected states, that finding a way to maximize people's participation, whether it's through a national dialogue, whether it's through community-based programs, where we know the evidence shows us a critical factor to any community-based initiative is the way in which people's participation is designed as appropriate to the context. So just one point to note there. The second is the one on violence against women, and I think two very passionate interventions by ministers from Côte d'Ivoire and CAR. And I think that this is an issue which the World Development Report wasn't able to say much on, because there's very little data on the nature of the problem, though we know it is widespread and it is tragic and is having an enormous impact on communities across Africa and beyond. And I just really would say a plea, anyone here who's involved in gathering data, doing research, we need to build up the data, our understanding and our analysis of violence against women, if we're going to have much more progressive work to tackle it. The cross-country learning is critical as part of that. Thirdly, I wanted to say a thank you to our Rwandan hosts for taking us to the Genocide Museum yesterday, which I personally found deeply moving. And I think the strategic importance of the way you took your guests to have that experience of, and sharing the experience of what you've been through as a nation is such an important part of building your nation and building the understanding of your friends and international partners of the road that you've travelled and where you're going. And I just wanted to say a thank you to you. I think there's a lesson that other countries could perhaps take away from Rwanda. We often hear that our international partners, like the World Bank, like others, do not relate to the experience of the countries coming out of conflict, that we bring our own frameworks and models. It's true, we do, and we don't necessarily understand, and we can throw labels like kangaroo courts at what turn out to be a really effective local justice mechanisms, and that importance of building the understanding between the countries that are moving out of fragility and the partners that want to help them, I think is a big takeaway for me. Thanks.
Thank you very much indeed, Bella Bird. Frederick Goloba.
Yeah, I think the one thing that I would like to say here is that the program within the context of which we have been conducting our research set out to try and identify non-conventional ways in which countries like Rwanda deliver goods to poor people. And I think that it's no exaggeration to say that Rwanda seems to have thrived on defying convention. And I think that that's one big lesson that I hope that the delegates to this meeting will take away with them. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor. And just anything you wish to comment on before we break for coffee, Minister?
Thank you, Zainab. I wanted to make 2 very brief comments. One is on gender development. You asked a question of why gender as opposed to national development, because everybody is supposed to be involved in the development process. And I want to advocate very strongly for women as a very important component of development. And in fact, I would like to challenge those of us who are working on the evaluation of MDGs to look at the impact of women in the achievement of MDGs by 2015. I have a feeling, and I could be wrong, that the fact that women are connected directly to all the targets of the Millennium Development Goals, whether it's nutrition, women's health, education, clean water, especially the rural women, is an indication that the more women are involved at the lowest level, at the grassroots level, in the villages, in the communities, is going to be a very important determining factor on the achievement of the Millennium Development Goals. Also, very quickly on dialogue, which we've discussed a lot this morning, to say that we did not, as a nation, engage in dialogue right after the genocide and stopped. That dialogue continues today. And in fact, every December, we have one coming up next month, every December, different representative sections of our society meet in our parliament chamber, and the President of the Republic chairs a meeting over 2 days where we check ourselves out. We talk about what has worked and what hasn't worked during the year. We have the citizens call in on the phone, by SMSs, this year on Twitter. We have Rwandans in the diaspora from various parts of the world coming into this national dialogue. So it's not something that ends because we become comfortable about where we are in terms of reconciliation and development. It's an ongoing process. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Foreign Minister, and thank you to Bella Bird, Country Director of Sudan from the World Bank, and Professor Frederick Goloba from Makerere University in Kampala. We will resume our discussions at 11:30, please, after we've had a coffee break. And just to tell you that after coffee, we're going to work right up until lunchtime, so that will be our final break before the end of this gathering. So thank you very much indeed in the meantime for your attention. Thank you.
abakomeje gukurikira gahunda za televiziyo y'u Rwanda, turacyari mu nama yo ku rwego rwo hejuru yo kureba uko amahoro yakwimakazwa inyuma y'amakimbirane. Havuzwe byinshi muri iki gitondo, ariko ikiganiro cyo muri iki gitondo cyaganiraga cyane cyane ku buryo u Rwanda rwakoresheje kugira ngo rwongere kuzamura imibereho myiza y'abaturage, kugira ngo rwongere kugera ku byiza rwagezeho, ndetse kugira ngo abantu bari hano, abatumirwa, abanyacyubahiro batandukanye batumiwe muri iyi nama nabo babashe kubyigiraho. Akaba ari nayo mpamvu rero abanyarwanda bagiye batanga ibyagezweho, ibyizwe bituruka mu muco nyarwanda, kugira ngo bibashe gukoreshwa mu gihe cy'ubungu. Muri akanya rero bagiye mu karuhuko gatoya, bari bugaruke mu kanya. Turakomeza kubana namwe tubagezaho imirimo y'inama, ndetse tubagezaho ibiganiro bitandukanye abari hano bagenda bagira. Akaruhuko kari bumare igihe kitari kinini cyane, turongera kubonana mu kanya.
Okay.
Bareka rero mukomeze mukurikire gahunda z'imirimo y'inama nyine uko zikomeza gukurikirana.
And economic growth rate in Rwanda is 8.8%, so Kampeta, you must be doing something right. So please give us your introductory comments on lessons from Rwanda on the effective use of aid. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Zena. I think this was very flattering. Hope I'll live up to the introduction you've made. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I'll try and focus mainly on the how rather than the what. I think most of us have participated in aid effectiveness meetings, and it tends to be the same thing coming up again about harmonization, alignment, coordination, and sometimes I think there's a bit of fatigue on these. So I'll try and focus on Rwanda specifically. I think the first thing that helped us in Rwanda is before dealing with aid management, let me call it aid management, because really a full-time job for some people, you have to deal with government affairs management, meaning how do you set up your internal political systems to develop policies, and that needs to be very clear before you start trying to organize development partners, whether you're talking about NGOs or donors. The first thing we agreed upon was that this was going to be, aid management was going to be a centralized system, meaning that it is centralized from the Ministry of Finance. And all the policy discussion take place a bit like I would say, in the kitchen, before they are brought to the table to be discussed with development partners. And that allows us to have one voice as a government. I think Dr. Binagwaho, Minister of Health, said it very well. You need to engage donors as one government as opposed to scattered institutions. And I would say that is really the foundation of your engagement. The second thing was really to say aid to do what, and we had to have a very fundamental discussion within government. And the focus was really the focus of delivery of services and delivery of reforms for the population. And as you have people-centered reforms, you have to, I would say, take risks in a way, because what you do is really, sorry, I think we should welcome His Excellency, President.
Your Excellency, President Paul Kagame, welcome to our continuing discussions on peace and state building. We are very glad to have you with us. And we have just started this session after coffee, and we are looking at lessons from Rwanda in terms of aid effectiveness. And the wonderful Permanent Secretary to the Ministry of Finance and Economic Planning here, Kampeta Sayinzoga, has just started off by giving us her perspective. And all she has said at the moment so far is that the key thing is to present a united face to donor nations and to the donor community, so that a government such as Rwanda speaks with one voice, that you don't have competing and conflicting interests from different departments and so on. And that's where she was speaking. And Kampeta, please do pick up where you were speaking from.
Thank you very much, Zainab. So as I was saying, the first thing that we had to agree is what were going to be the priorities at a particular point of time, and these change over time quite clearly. But often we agree on what are the priorities, but there's less of a discussion of what are lesser priorities. Let me call them like that, not like non-priorities, but lesser priorities. And this was a discussion that we had to have with donors to make it clear as to where government was going to focus on, both in the post-genocide period and as we move towards less of humanitarian assistance to more development assistance. The one thing that we had to put very clearly across the table is that time was of essence. And as you deliver reform, as you deliver for your citizens, time really matters. Because if you start a reform and it takes you 10 years, not only is there fatigue from the side of the administration, but there's also a lack of credibility towards your citizen. And that prevents you from carrying further reforms or bolder reforms at a later stage. People often ask us, after the genocide, did you have aid first or delivery first? And I would say they come hand in hand. Of course, you need one or two donors that are ready to take a risk on you, and we had the benefits of having, I would say particularly like DFID and the World Bank, take a bold step, give us budget support before we could put in place all the steps, and that really helps. But as you want to mobilize more resources, both domestically and internationally, what's very important is that you can communicate on your achievements, on your successes, and on your delivery. The second question that we get very often is, how do you ensure that aid is used wisely? And the first thing we always say is, of course, you have to create systems that hold you accountable to your own citizens before focusing on accountability what I want to say really is some countries put in systems to become accountable to donors only. But if you develop very strong systems to make you accountable to your citizens, then you can use the same systems to actually be accountable to donors. So when we talk about Rwanda being transparent, being accountable for every dollar from aid that is being used, it's because we're also accountable for every Rwandan franc that we get from taxation to our own citizens. And these are the same systems that we actually use to be accountable to donors during our dialogue with them. Two modalities really matter. I think yesterday our brother from Southern Sudan mentioned budget support. And we engaged the donors very openly. We actually had an aid policy that was adopted by Cabinet that said very clearly that budget support was our preferred modality of aid. And we had a very open discussion with donors as to what did they need to make the case back home to be able to move from projects or scattered interventions into a consolidated budget support. And that was really useful. Of course, you have issues of public financial management, which we focused a lot on, not only for donors, but for our own citizens. But we also had open discussions about issues of political governance. And in our dialogue, we try to avoid having anything as a taboo. So everything is on the table, and when we have disagreements, we have these disagreements quite openly. Then the issue of coordination, how do you coordinate? Our experience is that the simpler the aid architecture in the country, the better for governments, because then you can remain in charge. Often we don't have the same human resource available to deal with, I would say, these coordination structures. So if you have 1,000 coordination structures, you find that you're growing very thin, and it's very difficult for you to have a consolidated dialogue. So we have few forums, all, I would say, that culminate under the umbrella of the Ministry of Finance, but in which every single government department, NGO, private sector, civil society gets engaged. So really the formula that we've used is to keep it as simple as possible. And then measuring success in a way that's very transparent. We agree on indicators, we agree on what's going to be done, and we assess that in a way that is independent, and then have discussions on results. Now, if you don't do that, the risk is really that you start discussing process and have endless discussions about whether the procurement was done, which is important, but is not an end in its own. So having a discussion on outcome and outputs and measuring them quite clearly and transparently, and discussing really success and delivery is really key to avoid lengthy and windy discussions. Now, as you measure success, you need to set your own standards, and that's a discussion that we've had with donors that's sometimes a bit of a difficult discussion. You find that Rwanda often at the beginning was getting compared with other, I would say, with failed states, and say, oh, but Rwanda is doing so well, is doing better than this and this country, which is actually a failed state. And we said, no, we don't want to be compared to failed state, we want to be compared to success stories. And we're setting our own standards to internationally agreed standards and not to failed state standards. And as you set your standard, then it gives a lot of weight to what you do and how you do it and how you engage donors. And also, it avoids what I call the cost of bad advice, because there's a lot of bad advice out there that is based on very low standards. Then finally, I wanted to share with you the Rwandan, what we call Rwandan innovations in aid effectiveness. The first one is division of labor. You may have heard about it. We've discussed with development partners, with donors actually in this case, and agreed that they would intervene only in 3 sectors and have no more than 3 to 4 projects or 3 to 4 interventions. What it means is you have less scattered intervention, and you as a government can decide where you want them to take place, to intervene without having competing interventions. So division of labor, what we call division of labor, which is basically deciding which donor will intervene in which sector, and limited has really helped focus the dialogue. The second one is mutual accountability. We have actually put in place a system, which is like a traffic light system, where as government, we say, this is what we're going to do in the next 12 months. But development partners also tell us what are they going to do to make sure the quality of their aid improves over time. And then we meet, and we actually give them traffic lights. So red is for underperforming, if a donor has not reached its target. Orange means they're getting there. Green is they've met their target. So we hold each other mutually accountable. So the idea really is that as you give us better quality aid, it also helps us to achieve better results. And then the last one is really using aid for private sector development. We've realized really that as aid, having donor money directly invested into the private sector helps us widen our tax base, and eventually will accelerate winning off aid, which is at the end, I would say, the bottom line of the discussion. So as we look at the bottom line, we try to discuss more specifically how can we use this money to actually win or get ourselves away from aid and away from dependency or any feeling of dependency. And I would say it's working quite well, because as we started, 86% of our budget was actually aid financed. Today we're down to 45%, and we're laying strategies as we widen the tax base to try and lower it to actually reach zero as soon as possible. And that involves a lot of job creation, a lot of activities or interventions that also tackle the macroeconomic environment. So in a nutshell, I think...
Thank you very much indeed, Campetta Sayinzoga. And Campetta, just before you put your microphone down, yesterday President Kagame talked about the importance of the alignment of the national budget with the country's poverty reduction strategy. You've talked about how you have to involve the people, but just give us a few sentences on the government-led working groups that you have set up to use aid effectively to meet the national priorities that you have set out. Just how does it work in practice?
I would say the first step is really to have a clear strategy, whether you're talking about a vision 2020 or a medium-term framework, and that really comes from the grassroots. So as we develop sectoral strategies or medium-term strategies, we really have a bottom-up approach. And then once we have clarity and endorsement of these strategies, then we have a development partners forum, which is at the level of heads of agencies in country, which I co-chair with the UN resident coordinator, which meets on a quarterly basis, and where we discuss progress, we discuss how these strategies need to be maybe realigned and we also have a different forum specifically for budget support donors, because they basically give us a check out of trust and out of confidence of our system. So we feel we need to also give them direct feedback on how this money has been.
How do you elect those people at the grassroots, or do you feel that somebody from civil society might be better able to comment on that later? How do you actually engage people at the community level? How do you find them? How do you identify them, these working groups?
Actually, I think civil society can answer, but from what we do as a ministry in charge of national planning is already at the community. There is the communities are already organized, as the Minister of Foreign Affairs mentioned, through Budehe, through the various social programs. So we use the same organization. We don't create new groups. We use the same groups that are organized under Budehe to do consultations. And what we do is we basically start often from scratch, and we say, this is the question. If we're talking about, for example, social empowerment, we say, what do you think are the 3 top interventions that could help the poorest of the poor of your community? And they come up with ideas, and then we match these ideas with the evidence that we have at the national level, and that constitutes the base. So it comes from the already organized communities, it goes up through the administrative, what we call the administrative entities, which are the districts, and then the districts feed it back to central government. In this case, it would be the line ministries and the ministry in charge of planning.
Thank you very much indeed. Michel Arion, you are head of the EU delegation to Rwanda here. You've been in Kigali for the last 2 years. You are Belgian, a lawyer by training, a self-confessed workaholic. Is that right? You know Africa well. You've worked in development for 20 years at the European Union. You've lived in various countries in Africa, such as Côte d'Ivoire, and specializing very much in countries in crisis and post-conflict societies. Listening to what Campetta Sayinzoga said there, and your wider perspective as well, the donor community obviously is very, very keen in ensuring that there is accountability for any donor money, particularly at a time like this, when a financial crisis is really squeezing many donor budgets. And I know it's something that your Development Commissioner Anders Pilsberg has talked about a great deal, very much of late. So just give us the donor perspective in terms of aid effectiveness. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Indeed, I would like to offer a few comments from, I prefer to say it, partners' perspective than donors, because we are partners in the political field, we are partners in the development field, but also as someone who has been living here for almost 2 years and who starts perhaps to understand a few things of this country. I think the most important thing that we can witness here in Rwanda is an extremely committed leadership. And under leadership, I mean leadership from the top to the grassroots level. So at each and every step of not only the administration but also the organization of this country, you will find committed leaders. Committed to what? Well, basically, I would say committed to the stability and the security of their country, which is, of course, of primary importance for a country like Rwanda, but also to the development of their country. And what is very important, it's a fair and equitable development, and I really want to underline the word equitable development. That's extremely important. I think Professor Mutebi this morning and also the Minister of Health mentioned the fact that the growth and the benefits of development are equally and fairly redistributed to everyone in this country, not only in Kigali, but also in the provinces, in the regions, and it benefits really to the poorest fringes of the population. So frankly, sometimes we read articles about the fact that Rwanda development is just for Kigali and the rich people. It's not true. It's really not true, and I hope that very soon with this survey on the household in Rwanda, we will be able to demonstrate scientifically that the development is for everyone. And I would like also to flag in particular two programs just to illustrate that. It's the program on social protection. I think people this morning have mentioned the VUP and also the Ubudehe programs. Those really benefit to the poorest of the rural areas in Rwanda. Also the mutuelle de santé, the health community, is really an incredibly well-functioning system which gives access to everyone to a health cover. So we have committed people, we have committed leadership in front of us to dialogue with, but we have also accountable people. It was already said yesterday. I think it's very important. They are accountable vis-à-vis their own people, being through the executive chain of command or before the parliament or before the auditor general. So they have accounts to show to their to various instances. So we donors or partners, we do benefit from this accountability as well. So I think that this concept of accountability is also extremely important, and we must understand that it starts at home, the accountability. A word perhaps on ownership. It has been also said several times yesterday and this morning, but again I want to repeat that there is true ownership in this country. The Rwandans, they own their strategies, they own their policies. No consultant wrote the Vision 2020. No consultant wrote the poverty reduction strategy paper. In too many countries, in too many instances, we have seen consultants or UN agencies or the World Bank or even the EU, where I want to put me in the same basket, writing on behalf of a government a policy paper and asking the minister to sign. This is not the way it works here in Rwanda, and I think it's extremely important. So to use a common expression, the Rwandans are really in the driving seat, and not the driving seat of the taxi driver who is just going in the direction of his client, but really the direction in which the country wants to go. So we've got leadership, we've got accountability, we've got ownership. The last thing we really have with we partners with the government is dialogue, and I would say there are two types of dialogues: the political dialogue and the policy dialogue. In French, it's a bit difficult to translate. It's dialogue politique, but it's dialogue politique, political dialogue, but also dialogue on the policies. The political dialogue, it's very important because we are today at a conference on post-conflict situation, on peace building, on state building, and as it was rightly mentioned in one of the background documents we were given, state building is a highly political exercise, and I think the partners have have to give political answers and offer political solutions to political problems. So for that we need a political dialogue with Rwanda, and we can have it, and we have it, and I think it's extremely important. On policy dialogue on the policies, the sector policies, we have a very elaborated system of sector working groups and clusters where the donors, the partners do discuss with the government in the field of education, health, infrastructure, water, energy, etc., all technical sectors of development, but also governance and also decentralization or cross-cutting issues. We have this framework of sector working groups where we can have this dialogue. So, to summarize, with those 4 elements that I mentioned, ownership, leadership, accountability, and dialogue, I don't see any difficulty in Rwanda for the donors to apply the agenda of the aid effectiveness. And Campetta mentioned the system of division of labor. It is really working well and effectively, not more than 3 donors per sectors, not more than 3 sectors per donors, plus those who give budget support. And that is, I think, very important. Those 4 elements that I mentioned and do allow us, the donors, but in particular the European Union, to channel most of our aid through budget support. And budget support is the main of the tool for channeling aid, the most achieved development channel to indeed align ourselves to the priorities and the policies of the government.
Thank you very much indeed, Michel Arion. And picking up on something that Campetta and both of you have talked about, Campetta talked about the transition from humanitarian aid to sustainable economic planning. So from your experience of Africa, not just Rwanda, when is the time right? How do you judge when a country has reached the minimum level in terms of capacity requirements for it to assume this national ownership of its own program that you say is so important? How do you assess this?
Well, I do believe that it's not consecutive phases. You don't go from humanitarian to reconstruction and from reconstruction to development. The sooner you can start reconstruction and development, the better. So I worked, for instance, in Liberia. At the same time, we were delivering humanitarian aid in health, reconstruction in infrastructure, and development in education. So depending the sectors, depending the region, depending the most affected areas, depending the analysis that you do in terms of the quality of the leadership, the quality of the ownership, the quality of the policy in a given sector or in a given region, you can apply the 3 policies at the same time. And I think it's very important to understand that, because sometimes people want to make a distinction between the interventions of the humanitarian agencies or of the development agencies. I think it's exactly the same. They have to work together, but the sooner the government takes over the ownership and the leadership, the better.
But be honest, it's going to be difficult, though, for you to get the assessment and the accountability that you want when you are in the midst of a crisis for aid. I mean, it's easier in Rwanda, but not so easy in some other countries.
It's indeed not easy in many countries, and I was reflecting this morning on this the issue we discussed yesterday on the concept of one size does not fit all. It's true. So is Rwanda replicable? Is Rwanda really a model for the other countries? It is probably an ideal model for many countries, but is it really achievable in those countries? I think so. I think yes, it is possible, but that will need a lot of energy and a lot of commitment from the leaders of the countries emerging from a conflict. And as it was also mentioned this morning, it takes time to emerge from a conflict, and relapse occur very, very often. So I think it's good to keep in certain regions, in certain countries, in certain sectors, humanitarian assistance, because it takes really time to come to a point where you can have a full development policy applied in a given sector. But we know that, and we do our analysis of a situation of a country is made in full knowledge of those different concepts of relief or development, which are different, but again, I repeat, can happen at the same time.
Thank you very much indeed. And our other panel member, Gabriel Negatu, Ethiopian-born, but has spent most of his adult life in the United States, where you've worked in development as an independent consultant for various bodies like UNDP, United Nations Development Programme, the World Bank, and the IMF. And you joined the African Development Bank in 1998, and you are currently the Director for East Africa for the ADB. And just listening to what your two fellow panelists have said in this regard of giving support to establish measures for financial accountability and budget support and so on, do give us your perspective from this region. Thank you.
Good. Thank you. Thank you very much, Zainab. Let me perhaps take off from where Michel left, where he was talking about Rwanda being in the driver's seat. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Let me take off from where Michel's comment about Rwanda being in the driver's seat. I think, frankly, I am of the view now that this is almost becoming a cliche. Rwanda is in the driver's seat. We've said this too long and too many years. I think what is important when we talk about this country now is not that Rwanda is in the driver's seat, but we need to talk about the direction of travel. Where is this country heading? Where is it traveling to? The issue of being in the driver's seat is what I would call the new normal. You know, it's the new normal. It's no longer an exception. But what is untold, and then the story that needs to be told is, where is this country traveling? And then I think I will sort of touch on that. Also, before I kick off my comment, I very much enjoyed Campeta's presentation, and just for your information, Zainab, imagine having to sit across the table and negotiate with the likes of Campeta in this country, and believe me, there are many Campetas in this country. So I think it's a tribute to what I yesterday called indigenous capacity, which Rwanda is managed to build quite well. Now, let me kick off by quoting Paul Collier, who's I think known to most of you. In his book, The Bottom Billion, he argues the multidimensional aspect of post-conflict situations, whereby post-conflict countries are left with weak institutions, destroyed socioeconomic infrastructure, and fragile security issues. And then he argues that this in turn reduces economic growth by as much as 2 to 3% per year. Now, 2 to 3% per year reduction in growth, which in turn leads to more conflict. So he phrases this concept as the conflict trap. He calls it the conflict trap. And the question is, how did Rwanda manage to break out of this conflict trap, and how can we get other countries, emerging countries or out of conflict, break out of this conflict trap? And it's in this context that the issue of strategic and effective use of aid becomes paramount. Aid is a resource that needs to be managed strategically and effectively to break out of this trap. But again, the Rwanda experience, as I sort of hinted at yesterday, was Rwanda was able to break out of this trap around 3 pillars: the issue of visionary leadership, capable institutions, and indigenous capacity. I think these are the pillars that have helped Rwanda come out of this. Now, for most countries coming out of a similar situation, could be talking about Somalia, South Sudan, and several others, the priority action, of course, is to be able to attract adequate amounts of aid in the initial phase. You know, in an environment where aid is declining and where donor partners have their own agenda, it becomes a challenge to attract the right amount of aid. And this is a priority that needs to be nuanced in the process. I think a recent study by OECD showed that most countries coming out of conflict in this continent depend on a single donor. Now get this story. Depend on a single donor for more than 50% of their ODA. I think that puts any country at the mercy of a single donor, most likely the traditional or the previous colonial partner. So you have a situation of what you call aid orphans, where a country is in dire need of aid and doesn't get the right level of aid. Or on the other extreme, you have a situation called the aid tsunami, where every donor is running to your country, to a given country, with all kind of aids. And the challenge is to find that careful balance between aid orphans and aid tsunami. Now, what is required, as the topic here is, what is required to effectively use the resources that come from aid? I think for donors, or for countries like Rwanda and others, and this is where I think we can learn from the example of Rwanda, is that a country must have its own national strategy, fully prioritized, sequenced, and costed. So it cannot be a Christmas tree of everything that needs to be done, but it needs to be prioritized and sequenced, and more importantly, fully owned by the government and the people of a country. And again here, I think this is where very early this country was able to zoom in and come up with these kind of things. But it is not enough. It is not enough to have this. Even after you have done this, there's no guarantee that the ODA that's required will come in. I think to earn the confidence of donors and to get their resources, there are other factors that need to come in, and these are issues like transparency and accountability in the use of aid. Transparency and accountability in the use of your own domestic resources within a framework of a good governance context in any country. The issue of strengthening institutions, strengthening country systems. I know in this country, in the very early years, a lot of emphasis was put on strengthening the Rwanda Revenue Authority, the Auditor General, the Ombudsman, and so on. These are the institutions of accountability and transparency that have ensured, that continue to ensure that aid resources and domestic resources as well are going to what they're supposed to be used for. Commitment to inclusive growth. And lastly, commitment to tracking this aid and tracking the results that come out of it. I should share with you, recently I attended an event in Kigali in the parliament called the Imahigo. And this is an experience that, in fact, I have tried to introduce in the other countries that I am responsible for. This is basically where government and the different provinces agree on a work program, agree on a budget, and implementation takes place. At the end of the year, they come together and sort of peer assess each other to see who has delivered, who has not, and more importantly, discuss why. I think this is the kind of results I'm talking about. It is not only for donors, but it's also for the domestic resources that this country itself has raised. So I think these are the conditions. But last issue that I think is important for the country is the need for a strategy to wean the country off from aid. And I think in this regard, we should salute Rwanda, as it is now given as an example across the board, as a country that has now given itself a soft time frame to wean itself from aid to becoming self-sufficient. Campetta talked about dependency on donor aid coming down from 80 to 40. I think in the near future, in the next few years, we will see Rwanda, like a few other countries, become less dependent on aid and more dependent on FDI and domestic resources. I think this is very important. For donors or for partners, I think the lessons from Rwanda and other regions is, one is the issue of predictability. You know, for a minister of finance in any given country, but particularly in a fragile or post-conflict country, more important than the amount of resources coming is the predictability of that resource. To know and to put it in the budget that X amount of resource will be available during this budget year. And I think as donors have other political and other considerations, there is usually a tendency to cut aid, so there is a need to do that. The second is for flexibility of instruments. You know, when you give aid, there are several ways of giving aid. Campetta and Michel talked about budget support. In some countries that are not ready for budget support, you have balance of payment support. You have technical assistance support. So it's important that we don't go for a straitjacket and say, yeah, this is what I'm going to do. It can be budget support, balance of payment, investment project, but the aid must fit the situation in the country. It must fit, it must be customized to fit the situation in the country. And the third, the last is the commitment for sustained partnership. Coming out of conflict is not something you do easily. The risk of reversing back into conflict is very much alive. So there is a need for commitment over the long term. Lastly, let me just say that in the final analysis, this is not a destination that you head to and say, now we have arrived. What is important in Rwanda and in other places is the direction of travel and the trajectory of change. If a country is moving in the right direction, and if the trajectory of change is the right one, then I think we can celebrate that country as being successful.
So are you saying there, Gabriel, then, that there's a level where you say, okay, there's good enough governance, there is good enough inclusive growth because it's going in the right way?
It is, well, good enough governance is a rather loaded concept, and I don't think we will get into that in this meeting, but I think good enough inclusive is indeed important, because coming out of conflict, there is a trade-off. It cannot be having everything at the same time, and that's the issue of sequencing and prioritization. You know, do you go for stabilization or do you go for growth? And clearly there are trade-offs on both sides. So good enough inclusive growth and participation invariably itself leads to good enough governance. And I think, again, you have a very poignant example in this country where the shift is very apparent, but you may actually, you know, to be frank, you may agree or disagree with what has happened in this country. What is sure is you cannot disagree about the results. The results are on the ground. You may agree or disagree on the trajectory of travel or the direction taken, but we cannot disagree about the results on the ground.
Thank you. Okay. President Kagame and Prime Minister Soro, I will invite comments from you perhaps at the end of this particular session on what you have heard, both our panel and what the floor will say. So I will invite you to make some comments, if you so wish. Yes? Okay, good. But I'd like to go to the Deputy Prime Minister of Timor-Leste, who is the current chair of the G7 Plus group on the International Dialogue on Fragile States, because I think your input in this regard, in terms of aid effectiveness, is a very interesting one. Please.
Thank you. And great also to have Mr. President of Rwanda here this morning. G7 Plus is an initiative from the ministers of finance from some countries are also represented here. After the meeting in South Sudan just recently, G7 Plus became 90 member nations. It does represent over 350 million, but it's a forum that advocates for, I believe that around 1.5 billion people that live in fragile, whether it is economic or institutional and in post-conflict and conflict-affected countries. The focus of this group is to, together with the international dialogue partners, is to find better ways that the international aid be more effective in the receiving countries. If we just read the data from many international institutions or countries, we can sometimes ask ourselves, in the case of Timor-Leste, I believe that up to now some institutions say that the money that went to Timor is more than $1 billion during these years, and the Timorese people ask ourselves where the money goes, where the money went. So we don't sometimes see the visible transformation of the country resulted from this such amount of the money. That's why what the permanent secretary of Ministry of Economy of Rwanda just said about transparency and accountability to our own people and to development partners is a crucial steps. And in Timor we have done that. And today what G7 Plus is doing is to enter into dialogue with development partners and to see how we, to see if we can agree on what we call a new deal of aid that currently is being negotiated in Paris with international dialogue partners, and that is many developed nations are part of this international network of countries with the same aim, that is to have the more effective aid to the receiving countries. So right now these discussions are proceeding, and the aim is that when we get to Busan we can have an agreement there. And from the experience that we have is that the current international situation also, I think that everybody, even in Europe, America, and in our own countries, we are in a process of reflection if the economic systems that we have up to date has been successful, or how to change some of the systems that we have in order to that the economy benefits all. And the idea that we have for the G7 post-conflict countries is that if we can, for example, in the peacebuilding, the state building, in order to achieve the MDGs that are very important for all of us, if we can have 5 of the aims. One is that a state for all, safety for all, number 2. Number 3 is equity for all, and then 4 jobs for all, and 5 service for all. Then we can have more progress. And but again, this is a process in which we are all made reflections, and development partners as well as receiving countries like ours. One thing is important, that we want that the resource that comes from taxpayers from Europe or other countries be implemented in a proper way in our countries. And another, for us, it's more important also that our own people knows where the money goes, because otherwise we will read in newspapers that country A or B has received $500 million or $100 million, and our population one day will come to us and say, where is the money, where it goes. So this kind of transparent accountability, that's a very important one. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And it is something you hear in so many places in the world. Where has all the money gone? Thank you very much, Deputy Prime Minister of East Timor. I showed generosity to you because you were not only speaking on behalf of East Timor, but a whole body of countries that are described as fragile. However, I should not be so generous with subsequent interventions if you're speaking on behalf of your nation. So, may I invite interventions from the floor, please, on this issue of aid effectiveness? And Professor Gambari, is that you there? Yes. Briefly, if you will, please.
Yeah, absolutely. No, you asked a question about when does countries emerging from conflict transit from humanitarian assistance to early recovery and development. And I thought I heard Michelle of the EU seem to suggest that it should be concurrent, not a consecutive process. And he referred to the case of Liberia where there were emergence from conflict, there was development things taking place, recovery issues taking place. And this tallies with what the Permanent Secretary of the Ministry of Finance said, that peace dividends are demanded by people or countries emerging from conflict, and you have to do it as a matter of urgency, otherwise government loses credibility. I think this is a clear lesson for us in Darfur, where in Darfur, we of the peacekeeping African Union and UN, we have trouble persuading the UN country team to embark on projects of early recovery and development because they feel that the situation is not ripe enough for that. And I think what we'll take away from this is to strengthen our hands that you can't wait till all of Darfur are at peace before you do things that could actually help to build the peace and to address the root causes of conflict, particularly in the area of water. Thank you.
Thank you. A point very well made. Thank you. Other speakers from the floor, please. Bella Bird, Country Director for the two Sudans at the World Bank.
Thank you very much for a really stimulating set of panel presentations. I just wanted to follow up on 3 points which really struck me from, I used to work with East Timor co-chairing the International Dialogue which facilitated the G7+. And we spent a lot of time talking about, analysing and talking about the problems with aid in fragile states. And now they're coming to Busan with a new deal, which the Deputy Prime Minister mentioned, which I would urge everybody to support, joining Judy's voice yesterday. I think that's a really good set of ideas in that new deal. But what I really liked about particularly the Rwanda presentation was the way you focused on the how. And, okay, let's move beyond all the grievances that we've got about aid, and aid in fragile states particularly, and into okay, how do we make this work? And 3 things that struck me were with the leadership issue. And I think we know, and it's well documented, that when governments lead the way in terms of donors, they're much more likely to get a good result from the aid money. And donors, I've never seen, I've worked in a number of countries, and I've never seen or read about a single situation where donors have successfully managed to organise themselves to deliver on countries' priorities without strong leadership from government. And that's really key. And what I'd say is looking at that leadership, I think I can differentiate between the countries in which I've been involved in where they set up a good structure for aid coordination and where they combine structure with substance. And I think what really struck me about the case of Rwanda and another country I've worked with, Vietnam, it reminded me a lot about Vietnam, which is possibly the most effective country I've actually worked with in terms of getting the best out of aid, was that you've got a clear sense of where you're going and therefore how you want donors to align and deliver. If you don't have that within the aid coordination structure, then you have lots of meetings, lots of donors putting together matrices with long lists of projects, but no real sense of direction and delivery. And I think that's where you really seem to me to have a very strong edge. Just a couple more points. You mentioned results and the fact that if you're delivering results, you can keep your donors happy. I think that's a really important point. There's a lot of noise in the international system around results at the moment. Taxpayers back in Western countries feeling the pinch, focus on results, and we need to start looking much more at how we can, so that we can support you to deliver results, and then we tell the story back home to taxpayers and a hostile press and a sceptical board of directors, or whatever it is that we have to, whatever our governing structure is. And then finally, I just want to put a note of caution in about what some of the things we've learned. It's in the WDR and it's in other analysis about the danger of donors doing harm in fragile countries, and the need for self-awareness, and the need for an understanding of the context to form the way that we do our business. And I'm thinking back to some of the points made this morning, and I think by the Foreign Minister of Rwanda, around equity being the key to everything in Rwanda. When I worked in Nepal, we did an analysis of poverty, conflict, and aid, a mapping. And we found that where poverty and conflict was most significant in the country, aid was scarce. And I think there's new innovations now coming into the way that we can look at these issues to try and make sure that we're not doing harm in the way we do business.
I'm obviously not a very stern chair because everybody disregards what I say about time. Please, yes, a brief comment from you, sir, if you would introduce yourself.
Thank you, Zainab. I am Jose Nsengimana, ambassador of Rwanda to Addis Ababa, to Ethiopia. Closing the remarks made by Getu, you put him a question. You asked him if it was good enough. I just want to try to answer that question. I think in the case of Rwanda, I can say yes and no. Yes, because a step, a target is reached. But the process is continuous. So I can say no, because the target reached becomes automatically a new beginning. And it is a new beginning for a bigger step. So each achievement puts in a new challenge. And the process has no end. It is a question, once again, a question of values in Rwanda. For us, you know, the sky is the only limit. So the progress is continuous. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Ambassador. Yes, other interventions from the floor. This is the last opportunity for interventions from the floor. I think I see the Ambassador of Switzerland, Paul Sager, Swiss Ambassador to the United Nations. Briefly, if you would, sir.
Yeah, thank you, Saina. Just one or two sentences. I think in the current international budgetary and financial environment where international aid is getting scarcer, strategic aid effectiveness is all the more important than before. So there are countries who are not as far yet as Rwanda, and I'm speaking actually in my capacity as the Burundi chair. I think they have not come as far yet, and they need immediate needs and also need the long-term needs. And there is a certain, to just throw a stone in this tranquil sea of consensus we are having here. I have at times the impression that the international donors, and I'm speaking now directly to the World Bank and also the African Development Bank, they have a clear vision for the long-term needs, talking about infrastructure, long-term economic development, but the short-term needs, which are more political, like social reintegration of ex-combatants and things like that, there I, frankly speaking, still fail to see the understanding of the world, of the banks. You know, it's for them political, and therefore they don't want to touch it. So therefore, I think there is an appeal to kickstart the motor, and we also need to address these needs, and then to get the motor running and have a long-term commitment. Last word, maybe political accompaniment is important, and I think in that respect, another remark which struck me in a meeting of 2 days, which was co-sponsored by the Peacebuilding Commission, hardly any word has been made about the Peacebuilding Commission. I think it's playing really an important role as a complement, as a guarantee, as a safety net for getting aid. So I think that's maybe also an issue we have to talk about in the future. Thank you very much.
They are going to speak, and a Swiss representative is a revolutionary. You're all about consensual politics, so there we are. We will let you incorporate your response to that. Burundi, did you want to respond at all or make a comment? Did I see a hand here? Is it Burundi? Yes? Yeah, please, briefly if you would, sir, and then I will go to President Kagame and Prime Minister Soro.
Yes, it's really a question to the Permanent Secretary Minister of Finance. The aid really comes in various forms, as she tried to analyze, in terms of budget support, balance of payment, etc., etc. But there is one particular aid that I would like to have the Rwandan experience, how they have been able to manage it. That is, even after the relief situation has ceased, certain countries continue to channel their aid through NGOs. And it is that aspect really, for some of us, the aid coming through NGOs is sometimes likely elusive. One cannot easily account for them. So I would like to know how far Rwanda has been able to capture that into their development aid management.
Okay, thank you. When we have our concluding remarks from our panelists here, will you incorporate your responses both to that point and also from the Swiss ambassador? President Kagame and Prime Minister Soro, would you wish to make your comments now, or do you want to make them after, at the very end, before we break for lunch? What's your preference?
I think you can use my time for somebody else to...
Okay.
Yes, I'm happy with what I'm hearing.
You're listening?
Yes, I'm listening.
You're letting other people be in the driving seat for now. Prime Minister Guillaume Soro, would you wish to make any comment on what you've heard about aid effectiveness and anything else you've heard this morning?
Je suivrai le conseil du président Kagame et je serai aussi généreux que lui.
All right, I was just observing protocol there. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you for our interventions from the floor. We don't have much longer before we go for lunch, so if you would just incorporate your closing statements from what you've heard from the floor. Michel Arion from the European Union.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I think it's important what our colleague from the World Bank said, that no donor or no partner is able to deliver better in terms of coordination or efficiency than the country itself. And we don't know many cases, or any case, where a donor has been able to replace a country. I must say I was very happy to hear the Vice Prime Minister of Timor speaking on behalf of the G7+ and insisting on transparency. It's extremely important, and domestic, as I said in my preliminary remarks, the domestic accountability is the platform upon which you can build accountability vis-à-vis your donors or your partners. The last remark, we have heard several times the reference to the taxpayer, the EU taxpayer or the American taxpayer, etc. It's true that as aid agencies we are responsible vis-à-vis the taxpayer, but if I compare the budget, the aid budget, with other budgets, I feel not very comfortable, because I think that we probably have spent 10 times or 20 times or 100 times our aid budget in Libya or in Iraq or in Afghanistan, and I don't hear that reference of the EU taxpayer vis-à-vis the expenditures of the colleagues from the Defense Ministry. Someone mentioned the Peacebuilding Commission. It would be very interesting to compare the budget of the Peacebuilding Commission with the budget of peacekeeping operations. It must be, again, 10, 20, 100 times. Prime Minister Soro knows how much ONUSI mission cost to the international taxpayer. If Côte d'Ivoire could benefit from 1/10 of the cost of this mission for development purpose, I think he would be very happy. So we are spending fortunes on military expenditures and peacekeeping operations without, I mean, we have been doing that for 10 years in Côte d'Ivoire, 10 years in Liberia, 10 years in Sierra Leone, for nothing, I'm sorry to say. So the taxpayer is to be aware of that. So he better question those expenditures.
Are you making them aware with your voice when you go
Thank you.
back to your Brussels? Are you making them aware? You say that kind of thing to them there?
It's done already.
Do they listen to you?
Yes, they take note.
Oh, good. All right. Kampeta Sayinzoga, if you would like to make your concluding remarks, incorporating some of the points put from the floor, particularly the representative from Burundi.
Thank you very much, Zainab. Maybe just to start by answering the concern from my colleague from Sierra Leone. What we've done is we've been very open about aid through NGOs. We've actually clearly put it on the table that we think that now we have a government that is capable of delivering. And all official development assistance should be channeled through government. Now, that doesn't mean that government cannot work with NGOs. We do use NGOs to implement some of our programs or policies, but we've made it clear that we will not sign on any aid that is directly delivered to NGOs, and that we think that the right channel is through government first. At the beginning, to be quite honest, we've had a lot of resistance from the development partners, but we've put our foot down, and the truth is it's very difficult for some development partners to actually use or leverage resources back home without the support of the government. So when you make it clear like this, it's actually a way of making sure that the money is channeled through you, maybe to have NGOs as implementers, just like we use the private sector as implementers, but not as primary beneficiaries of official development assistance. Of course, that goes with building the confidence that your government is actually capable of accounting for this money. What we've also shown is the lack of transparency, actually, in the use of funds from NGOs, which is quite shocking. I think it's something that we've discussed in our development partners meeting, as to how much money is actually going through NGOs and is never accounted for, rather to the beneficiaries or actually to the donor themselves. So we have put ourselves in a position where they get better accountability from government that actually from most of the NGOs, either international or local for that matter. The second point that I wanted to make is really, when Rwanda started after the genocide, we were accused many times of being dreamers, of being too ambitious. And many donors did not believe that we could do what we did. And I think with time, we've proven that being ambitious as a post-conflict country is a good thing. And it's something that is actually possible and something that should not be laughed at, because a lot of these targets can be achieved, not necessarily through a lot of aid, but through a lot of political will. And then finally, I think we talked about confidence, and many countries that come on study tours in Rwanda ask us, how do you get this confidence to stand up to donors and sometimes even reject projects or reject aid as we've done in the past? And I think it really comes from your grassroots. When you know that your grassroots is believing in you and you have the support of your grassroots, as we've seen in the latest election, then you get the confidence. And we have put in place programs to actually ensure that the grassroots believes in government through, for example, I think Michelle mentioned the VUP program, which is actually direct support to the communities, and organized communities sees what are the payoffs of being organized and being organized for development.
Thank you, Kampeta. And Gabriel, I don't know if you wish to respond to the Swiss ambassador's point about not just focusing on the long term, but also the short term, demobilization, disarmament, the more political aspects.
Sure. Before I do that, let me once again emphasize this issue of, the colleague from the World Bank talked about the donor coordination and so on, and praised Rwanda for doing that coordination. But honestly, if I had my way, I would encourage this august body to leave Kigali thinking about what I call the new normal: less donor dependence, more foreign direct investment into this country. Let it be said when we meet here 2-3 years from now that Kampeta is busy coordinating the investors coming into Rwanda and not the aid donors. So I think it is an ambitious goal, but I think that's one we all need to look forward to. The Swiss ambassador on Burundi, We've had very robust discussion on this. Yes, we are largely focused on sort of the medium to long-term issues, focusing on infrastructure development and so on. And this is partly because the division of labor, between the different partners, which at the request of the government of Burundi has placed us to focus on infrastructure, energy, roads, power, dams, and not the demobilization and integration. As we indicated yesterday, we've done a little bit of that, but I think more the UN types and the non-governmental bodies are more equipped to handle interventions like that. But if, as you are the chair of the Burundi, my challenge to you is that instead of squeezing the World Bank and ADB to do some more, I think you should go out there and flag Burundi as an aid orphan. I think if you talk
Let him answer.
Huh?
Are you going to do that?
Sure, that's my task.
Okay, very good. If you talk to Moses, my good friend Moses from South Sudan there, they spend an inordinate amount of time mobilizing, coordinating the donors. And, just a couple of hours from Juba is Bujumbura, and the few donors that are there are pulling out for various reasons. So if we're going to put our resources together, let's do it to get more donors and more private sector to come in.
Okay, Gabriel, thank you very much indeed.